I thought I'd start by trying to cheer us up a bit with a situation report on how things are going on Brexit. Because if you were a Brexiteer and you were looking around right now and you were thinking of who the luminaries of the pro-Brexit movement and their attitudes, I think you'd be a bit concerned. You've got Daniel Hannan saying it's not going to plan. You've got Boris Johnson saying we're going into meltdown. You've got Nigel Farage saying he never thought it was going to be a success in the first place. You've got Nigel Lawson buggering off to France because he doesn't want to live here post-Brexit. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary. Pretty soon, the only person we'll have to speak in favour of Brexit will be Rees-Mogg's nanny. So, last week I spoke at Gwent for Europe in Cwmbran, and my heckler that day was wonderfully Welshly named Dye the Drains. He's responsible for clearing your drains if you're in Cwmbran, and if he clears drains with anything like the gusto he heckled me last week, you know, if you've got a problem in Cwmbran, go and see Dye the Drains, because he will sort it out for you. David, thanks ever so much for introducing me. I don't know why people are delicate about describing my having been sacked. I'm personally rather proud of having been sacked for standing up for what I believe in on Brexit. I was disappointed not to be able to continue with the work I was doing in Northern Ireland, because that's something that is very dear to my heart and a part of the country that I'm incredibly fond of, and I felt that I was doing quite important work as one of the people in the Labour Party who still has a link to the work that Labour did when in government, because I was the special advisor there for many years working on the peace process. So it was a shame not to be able to continue in that role, but nonetheless I can't say that I have any regrets about speaking out about what I think is the biggest crisis, catastrophe that our country has faced in living memory. And I think it is a duty of all politicians, of whatever party, to speak for what they believe in and to speak in the interests of their constituents and their country. And I felt that I was doing both, and I'm continuing to do both, which is why I'm here to speak to you today. We can all see that this is going disastrously badly. Not only is Brexit and the prospect of Brexit a catastrophe for our country, but the handling of Brexit, the management of the negotiations, the nuts and bolts politics of it being undertaken by the government and the Brexiteers in particular is spectacularly cack-handed. I mean, every day you wake up to hear another headline about another spat in the cabinet. Every day we wake up to find, you know, another version of what the border is going to look like in Northern Ireland, or how we're going to mesh with the customs union and the single market. I mean, it is a case study in how to screw something up right now. But we shouldn't, unfortunately, be cheered by that, because you know, there is still, at the end of this tortuous, tumultuous road, the prospect of Brexit. And we are, I fear, for all the speed bumps the Brexiteers are hitting, and for all of the way in which they're sort of peeling off in different directions and trying not to be caught holding the baby when the music stops, for all of that, we're still heading towards Brexit. You know, soft Brexit maybe, but Brexit nonetheless. And any form of Brexit, any means of Brexit, is going to be bad for our country. Yes. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a jobs-first Brexit. There is no such thing as a good Brexit. There is just a Brexit that is going to be more or less bad for the country. But bad is what it will be, I fear. And you don't need me to tell you that. You know it yourselves. And you know it because the government has conceded as much. The government's own assessment tells the country that we are heading for a lesser economy, a reduction in our GDP, irrespective or which sort of Brexit they take. It's just a question of how bad it is. You know, in statistical terms, it's, are we going to be 2% reduced in our GDP over the next 15 years, or are we in certain parts of the country going to be 16% reduced in our GDP over the next 15 years? It is truly extraordinary that we are, as a country, pursuing a policy that we know is going to make us all worse off. I can think of no other set of circumstances, historically, contemporaneously, in our country or abroad, where a government has knowingly cut its nose off to spite its face. And I think we've got to be honest about that and keep saying that to people and keep reminding people of the reality, because part of the problem we face is that there is still a rah-rah-rah pro-Brexit brigade that is drowning out some of the reality. It is slowly, I think, creeping into people's consciousness, and it is evident in the polling that there is a shift in opinion, and there is certainly a set of misgivings out there about what we now know to be the truth as opposed to the lies that were told to people during the referendum. But nonetheless, it's very slow work getting that driven into public consciousness, and I think there is still a relatively low level of salience of the understanding of how problematic this is going to be for us. Why did Brexit happen? I'm going to talk about how we stop it and whether we can stop it later on, but why did it happen? Because I think those of us who are still passionately opposed to it do need to engage with some understanding of the underpinnings of Brexit. And I don't think it's terribly complicated, to be honest. I think it's reflective of trends that are evident in our country and across the Western developed economies, and have been for a long time. It is at its most basic, I think, a rejection of globalisation. It is a sense that many parts of the country see a very real consequence of economic competition between our economy and other developed economies and developing economies, and an erosion of jobs and an erosion of security and an erosion of people's place in the world and their sense of identity and their sense of power. And it's also, I think, attached to a dysfunction of our politics and a sense that people feel that politics isn't working for them and that political representation isn't able to sufficiently mitigate the effects of that globalisation. That sense of cultural integration too, as the world becomes smaller and as populations merge. That's happening all over the world, and we've got to be honest about that. But the problem with Brexit, of course, that comes out of that sense of loss and disempowerment and lack of identity and basic sense that it used to be better around here but it isn't any longer, that is very evident in my part of South Wales and very evident in other parts of Britain where the Brexit vote was most strongly registered. The reality, the tragic reality, is that those are the very places that are likely to be hardest hit by the downturn in our economy, by the reduction in receipts and revenues, and the consequent reduction in the capacity of the state to provide the public services that people in particular in those post-industrial parts of Britain most rely upon. That's the supreme tragic irony at the heart of all this. And the further irony, of course, is Brexit does bugger all to fix those problems. Absolutely nothing. In fact, it is anathema to the solutions to those problems. There is no way in making Britain more isolated, more impoverished, less integrated, less connected, less tolerant, less open, less liberal. None of those things is going to improve our economy such that we are better able to provide the services and opportunities and wealth and prosperity that certain parts of this country desperately require. And the reality is, it's not in places like Bath where it will be hardest felt, it's in places like Bargoed, or it's in places like Favour in my constituency, ex-mining towns, ex-pit villages, places where steelworks or other industrial sites have closed. Those are the bits of Britain where there will be a deep and profound and long-felt change. Because if those economic statistics come through, even if it is at the lowest end of the spectrum, if it is that around 2% reduction in our GDP over the next 15 years, that's equivalent to the reduction we've seen since 2008 in the banking crash. That's what's precipitated fully 10 years of austerity in this country. Do we think that's going to improve the lot of people in Favour or Bargoed, or make it more difficult for them and their children, their grandchildren, to get on in the world? Well, I know which one of those things is true. I know which direction the country is going to take and what it will mean for those people. And I think it is a desperate, desperate tragedy that Brexit has been proffered as the solution to those problems, as the answer to the sense of loss and dislocation and lack of identity, when it would provide the reverse for people. It will make their lives more difficult. One of the other myths that I think has to be addressed about Brexit is that it's somehow patriotic. that it's a good thing to do for our country. Well, it's the opposite of patriotic, or that it's noble somehow. I spoke at one meeting with a Brexiteer who drew an analogy between the plucky Brits, as he put it, standing up to the European juggernaut. He said, we're like the boy in that famous photo of Tiananmen Square, standing with a sling in the route of the tank that was sort of pitilessly driving towards him. Well, it's entirely wrong, that analogy, but that isn't what we're doing. We are desperately swimming against the tide, because as I said earlier on, all of the global winds that we're talking about, all of those global changes, the globalization, the loss of jobs, the economic competition, the cultural integration, the challenges that all of that poses. Stop the world, I want to get off, Brexit, or desperate last throw of the slingshot at the tank, Brexit, isn't going to change those things. Not only is Brexit not going to offer immediate solutions to people's local problems, it's not going to change the course of history. We are going to be heading towards a more globalised, more integrated world. And the truth is, all of the real answers to the problems that we face, how we exercise greater control as a sovereign state, how we empower our politicians more, how we get greater control for our people through their parliament and their politicians over footloose global finance that makes it harder for us to extract the revenues that we need to provide the public services, all of the challenges we face in our environment, all of the challenges we face for security, crime, all of these things are best addressed through cooperative, collaborative, integrated solutions. And that, frankly, is as plain as a nose to your face. And it's more than that. It's plain to most people, whichever way they voted, when you describe it in those basic terms. So it is a double tragedy that we've foisted Brexit on people, and it will provide no immediate solutions and no long-term solutions. And it's already playing out, isn't it? We're already seeing the economic impacts. You don't hear enough about this, but we've undertaken an extraordinary economic experiment in this country. We've devalued our currency enormously. We've devalued our currency by more than just about any Western democracy has done, other than in a massive crash for the last 70 years. And we've seen practically no benefits from this, practically no increase in exports. Manufacturing is actually going backwards in this country. All of the things that they predicted would come from some of the benefits of Brexit. And let's be clear, greater control over monetary policy was one of the things that they imagined would come from this. Well, the reverse is already happening in our country. We're already seeing the impacts of Brexit. Foreign direct investment in our country, hugely important to those post-industrial parts of Britain like Wales, in decline in many parts of Britain. Business investment by already based here indigenous companies, declining in our country. Business sitting on its hands, waiting to see how Brexit is going to turn out, and knowing that if it turns out as they anticipate, they won't want to invest in this country. Is it any wonder that John Redwood, one of the great evangelists for Brexit, in Parliament when in public, is in private, we now know, telling the people he advises not to invest in our country? He's saying invest in Latin America, or invest in the Far East. Don't invest here, because you'll get greater returns by investing elsewhere. They are voting with their feet, these people. It's not just Lawson going to France, it's what they are saying in private, because they know that they've sold the country a pig in a poke. They've sold the country a pup. And unfortunately, they realise what the consequences of it will be. Take a South Wales example. Look at what we were meant to get from America, an easy trade deal that was going to be struck within weeks. What's the reality? We've got a president in America who is imposing punishing steel tariffs on our country that could lead to the closure of our few remaining steel producing plants, that could effect a shift in Britain away from being a steel producing country to being a steel importing country. That would be disastrous for manufacturing across the whole of the UK, let alone disastrous for the economies immediately around our few remaining steel plants. And that is the reality, because those trade winds that I was talking about earlier on, those global forces, are, unfortunately, in economy after economy, in country after country, blowing towards protectionism, isolationism, an old-fashioned sense of a nation-state standing against other nation-states. All of these things will be bad for our economy, and Brexit is unfortunately feeding into all of that. And then politically for our country, culturally, it feels to me that Brexit is already having a damaging, deleterious effect. One of the things that I think I'm most proud of about the last Labour government is, in all sorts of ways, through, I think, culture, soft power, as well as some of the legislative changes, Britain became a very much more tolerant, open, liberal country during the 1990s and early 2000s, in all sorts of ways, whether it's our attitude to gender politics or all sorts of things. We are going backwards in that regard. The volume of racist crime, the volume of racist abuse that is evident in the statistics, in the crime numbers right now, it's a very stark illustration of how Brexit is affecting the underpinning culture of our society, and it's deeply worrying for me as I stand here in a great outward-looking metropolitan, cosmopolitan city of Bath. It's very worrying that for many people in this country, and they are now experiencing illiberalism day and daily from their fellow citizens. And I think Brexit has in lots of ways enabled and encouraged that attitudinal change. And I'm not sure how we draw back from that, but I certainly think that pursuing Brexit will only be bad for it. And why is all of this so incredibly frustrating for me? Because I'm on the left of politics. You wouldn't know it to read my Twitter feed when I'm described as a sort of red Tory Blairite, but I'm actually someone who's traditionally been described as on the left of the Labour Party. The Tribunite, Bevanite, soft Labour left, if you like. I'm someone who fundamentally believes in equality and human rights and the universality of those things. I'm someone who fundamentally believes we need strong interventionist government. I believe we need higher, better targeted taxation in this country. We need greater spending on our public services. We need more freedoms, more workers' rights, more liberty for people. And that is why I cannot understand what my Labour Party, a movement that comes out of speaking for all of those values, is doing, not opposing this. Why are we? It's completely at odds with what I believe in, and it's completely at odds with what most people in the Labour Party believe in. My politics come out of South Wales. I described during the leadership contest that I contested so successfully with Jeremy Corbyn. I got 200,000, it wasn't bad, but he got 300,000 unfortunately. But I described that, I grew up in South Wales, in Pontypridd, in the town I represent, during the miners' strike. That miners' strike when family members were on strike, and in particular, a meeting I had during that period with a man called Bill Painter, who was he was in the winter of 1984, and Bill was shortly to die after I met him. He was in good health when I met him, and he was a communist. He was a communist commissar who was sent to Spain and went to Spain, one of the 100-odd miners out of South Wales who went to fight in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. He is someone who epitomised the internationalism, the belief in human rights and equality that extend beyond our shores to all human beings wherever they reside, and the faith of the Labour Party to go and fight for those things, the faith of the left in his case to go and fight for those freedoms and for those values. And it feels deeply painful to me that we are at the moment being cowed by this populism, that we are being cowed also, I think, in certain circles by a misguided sense of the EU as some sort of bosses club that we on the left should be resisting as we resist capitalism more broadly. I think it's a completely misguided view of what the EU is about, and it certainly fails to take full cognizance of the other damaging changes that will come alongside, even if there are any of these, in my view, illusory benefits that will come from our leaving the European Union. It certainly doesn't take into account the damaging things that will be affected, because we will end up with lesser worker rights, we will end up with lesser freedom, we will end up with less control over international finance, we will end up with a lesser ability to integrate our taxes across a wider jurisdiction in order to stop multinational companies moving their money around the globe and stopping the rents being gathered by the people. All of those things will become harder quite clearly as a result of our being a more isolated, less integrated country. That seems to me to be as plain again as the nose on your face. And then there is Ireland. David said earlier on that I have some experience of that. Well, I suppose I've been involved in Irish politics for the best part of 15 years now, as a special advisor to the last Labour government, and then as the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland for a period under Jeremy. And, you know, let's be very clear, we are playing with fire in the way in which Brexit is potentially impacting on the island of Ireland. The Tories are being incredibly reckless about the outcomes. You know, it is truly extraordinary that some of them, even some on our benches, such as Kate Hoey, have been moved to rubbish the Good Friday Agreement because it's seen as such an obstacle to implementing their version of Brexit. But, you know, it's more than the border. The border is quite clearly utterly totemic for people, in particular, of course, in the nationalist Republican tradition in Ireland, in the north and the south. And the reinstitution of a border would be incredibly inflammatory in the much more volatile and fragile politics than people appreciate, certainly on this side of the Irish Sea. Still, the politics of Ireland that is still, I think, much less settled than many would understand or appreciate. Reinstituting that border would be disastrous. You just need to listen to the views of the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland, no nationalist or Republican, who thinks it would be damaging to the health and safety and well-being of his officers, who thinks very clearly that any infrastructure at the border would be blown up. But of course, the very idea of the border is going to be inflammatory for the politics underpinning it. And what people seldom fail to appreciate is it was joining the EU that allowed the border to disappear, not the Good Friday Agreement. The border went prior to the Good Friday Agreement, in effect. Goods were moving back and forth in Ireland across that border, albeit with infrastructure at the border, much more freely after 1994 than they were prior to the joining of Ireland to the EU. So the border is more than an importance prospectively, retrospectively, looking back at how membership, joint membership by Britain and Ireland of the EU enabled the Good Friday Agreement is something that we've, I think, too little explained or understood in the country. You know, it will be disastrous if that border goes back in. And the reality is, unless we are in the customs union, and unless we are in, or very, very closely aligned with, the single market, we will inevitably end up with a border of some sort. Whether it is with this, you know, infrastructure away from the border, or the maximum facilitation, or whatever the latest, you know, bullshit bingo acronym is from the Tories. The reality is, we'll have a border, and if there is a border, you know, it's in the mind that it matters as much on the roadside, that it will be an impacting factor for Irish politics. You know, we shouldn't even be countenancing it. It should be completely impossible for any government of any stripe to imagine doing anything that results in the possibility of a border going back in Ireland. So can we stop it? Let's be really clear. Yes, we can. You know, it is not easy. It is still, I think, a slim chance. If we are honest with ourselves, the real danger is that we are sliding down that slipway towards Brexit. But I think there are good reasons why we should be hopeful that it is still possible for us to stop it. And I wouldn't be touring the country speaking to groups like this if I didn't think that, if I didn't believe in my heart that it was still possible to change the course of Brexit, I wouldn't be bothering to do this. But it can be stopped. How do we do it? Well, I'll be blunt. The Labour leadership is absolutely essential to this. I think we have a degree of culpability as the Labour Party for not having led the referendum campaign and the Remain campaign with the vigour and passion and breadth of vision that was required. We were pusillanimous during a lot of that campaign, in my view. And without the leadership of the Labour Party as the biggest opposition party in this country, then I think we were doomed to failure at that referendum. And the fact that it was so narrowly contested and lost, I think, breaks my heart that we didn't fight it much, much harder, and that we didn't do so with the sorts of vision and passion that I think is clearly possible to convey to people, ordinary people who could have understood how this was bad for them in future if we would pursue it. Parliament is going to be key to it. Next week, it's good timing getting me to come and speak to you today. Next week, in the Brexit bill, the withdrawal bill, coming back to Parliament for 12 hours on Tuesday and 12 hours on Wednesday. One small victory. They were trying to do it all in 12 hours on Tuesday, which would have been utterly ludicrous, given that there were 15 plus amendments. It would have meant we'd had sort of 15 minutes to discuss each amendment and 15 minutes to vote on each amendment throughout the day. Clearly an attempt by the Tories to just railroad this through Parliament. So they've been forced to have an extra 12 hours, for which we should be incredibly grateful, of course. And there are some incredibly important votes coming up. The most important votes, in my view, there is a vital vote on the customs union. Are we going to stay in the customs union? That's crucial, and I think that is on the Wednesday. There is an absolutely critical vote on what will happen if the withdrawal bill is rejected, if Brexit is rejected in October or January or whenever the final vote is. What the terms of Parliament's ability to have a meaningful vote will be. That's absolutely critical, and you will have seen that the Tories are desperately trying to water down the amendment that was passed in the House of Lords, trying to merely reduce it to ministers in the event of Parliament turning down the Brexit deal as proffered whenever it comes to us towards the end of this year. Parliament simply having to tell ministers to go away and think about it for 28 days before coming back to Parliament with what? With a fresh deal? We don't know. That's insufficient. Parliament has to be able, on behalf of the people, this was after all about taking back control for our sovereign Parliament, wasn't it? So Parliament has to be able to dictate to some extent what the options are available to the executive in the event of the Parliament rejecting the vote. And crucially, because Parliament is not enough, in my view, one of those possibilities has to be a vote for the people of this country. If we are to truly stop Brexit, then the people have to own the stopping of Brexit. It is not sufficient, I'm afraid. I wish that it were for Parliament to vote against it. It is not sufficient for Parliament to vote in favour of the EEA versus Labour's rather fudgy, kick it into the long grass amendment next week. And let's be clear, I will be voting for the EEA amendment as the most sensible way in which we retain membership of the single market. So that isn't enough. It will require a further people's vote. And to those people who tell me that that is anti-democratic, I tell them that I think that's nonsense, that it is uber-democratic, that is doubling down on democracy. To turn to the people and say, we trusted you to give us a mandate to start these negotiations, to open discussion with the EU. You've now heard 2 full years. Isn't it extraordinary that almost 2 years after this referendum, the country is still talking about this day and daily? It is still the lead item on the news pretty much every single day. And it's still something that is miraculously discussed down the pub on a Friday night. That's because it's incredibly important. But it's also because it's unfolded for people. They've had a growing appreciation of the complexity, of the nuance. Most people in Parliament didn't understand
how a customs union worked. Most people in Parliament didn't understand the difference between the EFTA, the EEA, the single market, precisely what regulatory alignment meant in respect of different goods. Most people in Parliament certainly didn't understand how the crankshaft of the Mini moves back and forth 5 times across Europe before it gets into the factory at Cowley. These things have been new to parliamentarians, let alone new to the country. So it is entirely reasonable when you get to the end of this process and you've got clarity as to what Brexit is really going to mean, as opposed to the bullshit that was peddled during that referendum in 2016, what it's actually going to mean for the lives of people living in Bath and Bargoed, that's the point at which you say, we trust the people again to make the right decision. And I think if we did that, I think people would change their mind. I think people would see that there are many greater downsides associated with Brexit than upsides. And even if many people still have a sense of Brexit being something they'd like to see happen, I think many people would realise that it ain't as simple as it was sold by Rees-Mogg and Nigel Farage and Lawson and all the rest of them. It's much more difficult, and it has much more profound consequences for the lived lives, the real lives of individuals, the length and breadth of Britain. I'll close by saying I dropped my son off today at UWE, down the road in Bristol, where he's thinking of going to university. He's 18, and he's thinking about going to do an ecology and wildlife conservation course there. And as I drove into their very beautiful campus, my heart was lifted at the thought of my son getting out and walking amongst all the many other beautiful teenagers walking through the sunshine, all looking forward to experiencing university, all looking forward to the rest of their lives. And it breaks my heart to think that we could be reducing their opportunities, narrowing their horizon, limiting their capacity to reach out from this country into the wider world. In a city like Bristol, that is like Bath, a great cosmopolitan, outward-looking, international city, to be thinking of reversing those trends seems to me to be a crime. And I cannot, in all conscience, stand by as a politician, in the Labour Party or elsewhere, and I will always be in the Labour Party. I cannot stand by and just let that slide. We've got to fight. So I'm so pleased that so many of you feel likewise, because I see there's a few people nodding in the audience. Let's keep going, and I think we can change the country's mind, and I think we can reverse Brexit. I think we can stop Brexit. Thanks very much.